I'm Nadine Richterman, the Florida and Midwest Regional Director of CAMRA, and I'm excited to be here today moderating today's program with Sarit Katz on Your Media Activism. CAMRA's mission is to promote the truth about Israel, fighting anti-Israel bias, misinformation, and inaccuracies in the media and on college campuses. CAMRA does what few others can or will do to defend Israel against damaging bias that can undermine public support for Israel. Our program today focuses on one way that we do that, through our media response team. CAMRA has a tremendous team of analysts in our headquarters in Boston, in Washington, D.C., and in Israel, who continuously monitor the major media outlets in the US, the UK, Spain, Israel, and currently the Arabic language versions of certain English language publications. These analysts reach out directly to journalists, editors, publishers, and producers, explaining falsehoods and requesting corrections. But the question is, what happens when we don't get those corrections? This is when our media response team and you get involved. Sarit and her team send out alerts to our thousands of letter writers so they can contact the media outlets involved to demand corrections. Misinformation lives on the internet forever, so it's critical that this misinformation is corrected. Today, Sarit will explain how to recognize media bias and what you can do about it, because you are key to our success. Your voices are invaluable, and whether you're communicating to reporters who have missed the mark or to editors, publishers, or producers. At the end of Sarit's presentation, we'll take questions. Please move your cursor along the bottom of your screen to the Q&A icon, type your questions, and we'll answer as many of them as we can. But before I hand the program over to Sarit, one final note. We cannot allow efforts to delegitimize Israel, whether politically, economically, morally, or emotionally, succeed. That is why CAMRA does what it does. But we can't do what we do without your financial support. CAMRA is a not-for-profit 501c3, which means we depend on each and every one of you to exist. Unfortunately, those analysts I mentioned a few minutes ago really do get upset if they don't get their paychecks every month. We can't offer programs such as this one today, or do the myriad of other programs and projects that we do without your generosity. So at the end of the program, please sit down and write a check to CAMRA, or go to camra.org and click on donations. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Sarit Katz, CAMRA's director of our media response team. Sarit?
Thanks, Nadine, and great to see you, and thank you all. Thank you all for joining, and thanks for being involved and engaged and sometimes enraged at the media bias against Israel. I'm going to jump right into it. I'm going to share my presentation and see if we can get started. I'm going to first go through recognizing media bias and try to do that kind of quickly. It's sometimes a little subtle even. So many of you already know how to recognize media bias, but it's always good to have a refresher course, and you might even pick up a few things that you sometimes wouldn't notice. And then I'm going to talk about what to do about it. And that is mostly make your voice heard, get involved, write some letters to the editor. And I'll talk about how to do that and how to make them effective. Now, the first kind of bias is just the over coverage of Israel. So if an alien landed on Earth and read the newspaper or watched TV to learn about the planet, this alien would think that Israel was an enormous country with billions of inhabitants instead of a teeny tiny little country with just a few million people. And that is one of the I mean, you don't even know what's going on generally in Mexico, for example, one of our close neighbors and biggest trading partners, or Canada, but you know every little thing that goes on in Israel. That's bias right there. But then once the stories are written, how do you identify bias within those stories? And in this case, bias manifests itself in a number of ways: factual errors, a lack of balance, omission of important facts and context. We'll talk a lot about that. Double standards and editorializing in a news story. Factual errors can be very difficult to pick up because you don't know what you don't know. So if you're reading a newspaper story about a subject you don't know about, you are likely to just assume that everything in the story is correct. Now, you know a lot about Israel and the Middle East, and so you might be able to pick up factual errors. But rest assured that your average reader, and that includes many in the Jewish community, most of your friends, most of your colleagues, and even your family, may not be able to recognize these factual errors. And you even have to stay up to date, to follow breaking events closely, to know your Middle East history, both modern and ancient, to keep up on the many related subjects that are reported on, like, for example, Iran and the conflict in Syria, what's going on in Lebanon, etc. The Abraham Accords, of course, has to do with Israel, but what about Egypt? So these things you need to keep up on as well. And lots of information, of course, is available on the camera website. Now, a lack of balance is when the story, whether it's a print or on television or radio, the story focuses only on one side's point of view or predominantly on one side's point of view. And sometimes it's even more subtle than that, where they'll have both points of view, but proponents of one point of view are quoted directly. John Smith says, quote, while the other point of view, the pro-Israel point of view, would be, this isn't true, sources say, according to the prime minister. So when something is paraphrased or Israeli spokespeople deny this, this person has no name, this person is, there's a layer, a disconnect between the reader and the speaker or the person asserting the Israeli point of view. Sometimes you'll also see, this was classic in NPR, where they would have, they claim to have an equal number of voices on both sides, but the Israeli side, you see, you'd have somebody on the Palestinian side, you'd have a Palestinian leader, and then you'd have somebody on the Israeli side, and you'd have an Israeli human rights organization. So they said it's equal, but the Israeli human rights organization would be something like B'Tselem, which is not really an Israeli human rights organization. It's really a Palestinian rights organization that happens to be based in Israel. So even their pro-Israel or their Israeli side would actually be half Palestinian. So it's really 3-to-1, not 2-to-2. That's a lack of balance. Omissions. Omissions of important facts and context are the most prevalent and most subtle types of media bias. And this is very, very hard for us to get corrections on, because everything in the article can be true. All the facts, that is, in the article can be true, while the narrative of the article is completely false. Completely false. And I'll give you an example. So if I had been presenting this in the Boston office of Camera, we might say, Sarit was driving to the office, drove up on the sidewalk, plowed into a group of pedestrians, 3 of whom were killed. That story makes me sound like one of the car ramming terrorists that rampaged through the streets of Israel for quite a time. On the other hand, and if the story said, Sarit was driving to the office, had a heart attack, lost control of the car, drove up on the sidewalk, plowed into a group of pedestrians, 3 of whom were killed. It's a completely different story. You see that all the facts in the first story are true. So when we go to a journalist, an editor, and say, this story is biased, they go, well, all those facts are true. But the omission of the important facts and context, that is to say, she had a heart attack and lost control of the car, those just aren't in there. So this cherry picking of facts is very, very common. Hard to spot, but very important. And that's why you have to educate yourself. The very frequently omitted facts are the 10-month settlement freeze, where they talk about settlement construction. You're going to see a lot more of this kind of talk in this new administration. Previous offers of statehood, completely ignored generally. Egypt controlling a border with Gaza. So you'll hear a lot of issues in Gaza are Israel's fault. Egypt controls a border with Gaza, totally missing. The thousands of rockets and missiles from Gaza, the hundreds of thousands of rockets and missiles hidden in Lebanon, attacks from Syria, etc. Palestinian incitement of violence, paying terrorists, etc. These are very frequently omitted, and many, many, many more. Double standards in the reporting in general. So you'll see where one group is singled out for more criticism. You may recall that a few years ago, and there have been many instances, but this one seemed to me to be so telling that I still use this example. But a number of years ago, there was a big brouhaha about gender segregated buses in religious neighborhoods in Jerusalem. And the truth of that is that women were sitting in the back of the buses and men were sitting in the front of the buses. Now, I don't like that. That's not something that would make me feel comfortable. But that was by the choice of the riders on the bus. And in fact, because they were going through religious neighborhoods. Now, if a secular woman got on the bus and wanted to sit in the front, the male passengers may have given her a hard time and made her feel very uncomfortable. And that may have been very unpleasant. And again, I don't support that. But that's not Israeli law. That's not something that Israeli law provides for. In fact, it's something that Israeli law condemns. However, state-sanctioned discrimination against women in Arab and Muslim countries is very common. And that wasn't even covered. That's almost never covered. Different terms used to describe the same phenomenon. So, of course, the 9/11 terrorists are terrorists. We're even seeing talk now in the United States of domestic terrorists. That's something that is those words are being used. But when you have real terrorists perpetrating atrocities against Israelis, they're called militants. Now, when I was younger, somebody who was militant was, really angry. You might have a friend who was a militant vegetarian. Now, they might not want you to eat a hamburger in front of them, but they probably wouldn't stab you to death. That's the difference between a militant and a terrorist. Editorializing in the voice of the journalist. Now, of course, editorials are perfectly fine, and editorials belong on the editorial and opinion pages, but not in the news pages. And what you'll see a lot is where journalists will use loaded emotional buzzwords in the news stories, or else they will simply state an opinion, but that's their opinion and not properly attribute it to any particular source, any named source, even unnamed source, or even some sort of expert of any kind. Well, they'll just state something that's an opinion as if it's a fact. But some of these emotional buzzwords that you see a lot are, for example, occupied Palestinian land, Again, there is no occupation. Those territories are disputed. And Palestinian land would imply that there was at some point a state of Palestine and it was Palestinian land. There never has been and never was a state of Palestine. In the area where Israel now is, there has only ever been sovereign states that were Jewish states. That area has been part of many, many empires throughout history, but it has never been a sovereign state except to be a Jewish state. The first kingdom of Israel, the second kingdom, and the modern state of Israel. And that's it. Illegal Jewish settlements, again, not illegal, not settlements. One might, international law is a very murky area, but you can certainly get many international law experts to say they're absolutely not illegal. In fact, perfectly legal and encouraged by international law, even over the green line, the supposed green line. And settlements, I might call them neighborhoods, towns, but you'll hear that a lot. And look at the pejorative words being used: illegal, occupied. And one of my personal favorites, of course, Arab East Jerusalem. Arab East Jerusalem, of course, has the Western Wall in it, the Kotel. The Jewish quarter is in so-called Arab East Jerusalem. There really isn't even an East Jerusalem, because in the 3,000-year history of Jerusalem, it's only always been one city, except for 19 years when half of it was occupied by the Jordanians, who ethnically cleansed the Jewish residents out of it. Up until that point, there had been Jews living in Jerusalem for millennia continuously, and the population was predominantly Jewish and for many, many years. So this is another loaded term, and it just becomes, it's used and it's in there, and you'll see that a lot. That's editorializing. Here we have a very brief article, and I want to show you how, in this case, it's the headline is the problem here. Because when you're reading a newspaper, you might scan it, and this is true online. You scan the headlines. You scan the headlines, you see the headlines, then you decide whether or not you even want to read the article. So while you might see an article about Israel and become interested in it and want to read it, many of your friends and colleagues will just read the headline, and that will be 100% of the information that they have on the subject, because they won't read the article. And in this case, the headline says, Israeli airstrikes wound 8 medics. So if you just read that headline, you would think that the Israelis had bombed a hospital or some kind of a medical encampment. The truth is that didn't happen at all. If you read the story, you'd see 3 Israeli airstrikes on the Hamas-run Gaza Strip overnight wounded 8 Palestinians, one of them seriously, medics said. So this didn't happen. So you'd say medics, maybe medics, and then colon, Israeli airstrikes wound 8. But definitely not Israeli airstrikes wound 8 medics, because Israeli airstrikes wound 0 medics. Then it goes on to say that this was on smuggling tunnels and metal workshops, which are, of course, rocket factories and therefore perfectly good military targets, and that this strike was in response to a terrorist attack from Gaza. So what happens is you could change it and say, terrorists bomb Israel. Israel responds. There's your headline. But that's how that headline works. And you don't even get to the Israeli side until you're in the second half of this little article. And that's the other thing. People don't often read all the way through an article, particularly if it's a long article. And so you may see only the Israeli side at the very end, or after you have to go to the next section or scroll way down. So these things are, you'll see them a lot. In this case, bus explodes in Jerusalem, people taken away on stretchers. And you see the headline. And in fact, it looks like the picture might actually be someone being taken away on a stretcher. But in fact, this person being taken away is not on a stretcher. This is, if you can read, it says, Palestinians carry a man killed during an Israeli airstrike east of Gaza City to the morgue. So they're carrying him to the morgue. This fellow was not in Jerusalem, was not on the bus, has nothing to do with the story. So you'll see that a lot, where the pictures have nothing to do with the story, because the pictures like to show Palestinian victims. They don't like to show Israeli victims. You'll also see that the bus exploded. Nobody blew it up. It just exploded. It wasn't bombed. There wasn't a suicide bomber on board. It wasn't sabotaged in any way, just exploded while the Palestinian was killed. His car didn't just explode, he was killed. So there's the kind of bias you see. This case is just a very small piece that was on the front page of the New York Times, but it's telling you to go to A5, the fifth page. And just in this little one sentence, you get some pretty good, instances of bias. So rockets follow Israeli airstrikes. Obviously, the Israelis started it. Okay. A warplane blows up a minivan carrying senior Hamas militants in the Gaza Strip, and Palestinians respond in kind. Now, Israelis apparently drive warplanes, not a plane, not a jet, a warplane. And the militants, again, they're not terrorists, they drive a minivan, not a vehicle, not a van, but a minivan. Now, when Americans read minivan, they think of, grandma driving kids to soccer practice. That's a kind of a vehicle that you can relate to. But a warplane, not too many Americans are driving warplanes. So you see the othering of the Israeli side and the kind of humanizing of these militants. And now, do you really think that they responded in kind? Does Hamas target Israeli military leaders just like Israel targets senior Hamas operatives? No. Hamas indiscriminately targets Israeli civilians. And if they had their druthers, they hit a nursery school. That's not in kind. You need to monitor the photographs because, as we said, they don't necessarily have anything to do with the story. And even if they do, they will often show the Palestinians as victims and Israelis only as soldiers. When you look at stories about Israel, look at the pictures and see how many Israelis you see who are not either soldiers or Haredim, the black hats, because that is how most Israelis are portrayed in the photographs. Whereas you will see a lot of Palestinian children, you'll see Arabs in interesting ethnic garb, but you don't see, run-of-the-mill Israelis. You'll see the ultra-Orthodox and you'll see soldiers. And it's really an interesting coincidence because studies show that the two things that make Americans the most uncomfortable are militarism and religious fundamentalism. And so it's very interesting that those are the things that are shown mostly in photographs of Israelis. And then we're talking about on the editorial pages. As we say, you're allowed your own opinions, and on the editorial pages, they're allowed opinion pieces. But the facts in the opinion pieces, the stated facts, have to be facts. You're entitled to your own opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts. So when there are factual errors, they have to be corrected, and the pieces should be balanced over time so that you don't have, multiple anti-Israel pieces and then one pro-Israel piece, and then multiple. So keep track of them sort of overall as well as individually. So now that you have spotted some biased reporting, what can you do about it? Of course, you can let us know. That's important. But please, please, please immediately sit down and write a letter to the editor. They're very important. They're very highly read, and it's not hard. A lot of times people will feel a little intimidated by the process, but I'm going to de-intimidate it for you right now. I just made up a word, but I'm going to make you see how very, very easy it is. In fact, it's as easy as ABC, answer, bridge, and close. So you found some article, maybe it had a number of bad points in it, but pick the point that disturbs you the most and counter that claim right off the bat. Answer it. So, for example, you might say, in George Smith's op-ed piece on January 15, entitled Israeli Policies Hurt Palestinians, the writer incorrectly claims that Israel practices apartheid. Boom. You said it's incorrect. You've answered. Now you bridge by filling in with facts. Arab citizens have the right to vote. They have freedom of speech and religion. Arabs serve in the Knesset, the Supreme Court, have access to the best medical centers in the world. Apartheid is a system of racial segregation where one racial group does not have the same political, legal, and economic rights as others. In fact, in Israel, it's against the law to discriminate. Okay, now you've bridged in, you've filled it in with facts, and you close with your own point. So you might want to make the point that Israel's Arab neighbors practice religious and gender apartheid without any public condemnation. Only by addressing concerns where apartheid is actually practiced can the lives of the Arab people improve. So very quick, very easy. Don't spend a lot of time on it, and don't get all in your head with it. It's not that hard. And just give yourself, say, 20 minutes and just sit down and do it. Say, I'm done after 20 minutes. And of course, we send alerts with lots and lots of information and exactly the contact information of who to send material, your letters to. So definitely sign up to get on our email team. And once you've written the letter, I want to tell you how best to get it published. And that's the 10 commandments of letter writing. So like Moses, I'm going to give you 10 commandments. So the first is when you're writing, be quick. So send your letter right away, within a day or two of the broadcast or the article, especially if it's an article and it's going to be printed, whether in the paper or online. These are very highly read, but your chances of getting printed go way up if it's within 24 or even 48 hours. Be convenient. 2, state the title, author, and date of the piece so that the letters editor doesn't have to search for your reference. It can be in the subject line of the email, that's very effective, or in the first sentence of your email, that works as well. The truth is, most people don't realize the letters editor just reads the letters to the editor. They don't necessarily know every article that was printed in the publication. So they need to know the date and the headline and the author because they need to look it up. So that's very important. Be pithy. Number 3, a reader scanning the letter should know very quickly exactly what your point of view is. So no circular language. Be concise. You really only get about 150 words for a letter to the editor. They don't want to publish letters that they have to do a lot of work on, and you don't want them to edit your letter because they will invariably edit out that one sentence that you thought made your point the best. So try to keep your letter short, 150 words, 200 max, And that way you have a better chance of being published. And when you are published, you have a better chance of liking the version that they publish. Be focused. So an article or a broadcast may have many, many instances of bias. Many objectionable things might be in it. Just concentrate on one or at max two. You can, if you want, refer to the overall skew of the broadcast or the article, but then zero in. So, for example, your broadcast unfairly disparaged Israel with its numerous factual and contextual errors. One such error was, and then go right to one. Or don't even go into the whole thing, but just go right to your 1 or 2 points, because it's better to fully explain them than to inadequately cover 5 or 6. And plus, remember, commandment number 4, be concise. Be polite. Number 6, hostile or overly emotional language is counterproductive, because they're not going to publish it. They're going to think you're a crank, and it's just going to die there. Whereas they'll read it. I mean, they read these letters to the editor, and that's important, but you don't want them to dismiss you. So use factual information, a lot of which can be found, of course, on the camera website and certainly in our alerts. Number 7 is to be yourself. You don't have to be an expert or a scholar. You are a reader, and the letters to the editor is your forum, so you belong there. Now, if you are a scholar, an expert of some sort, it's perfectly fine to use your title. That can help, but it's very important to make sure that they know you're a reader. That's good enough. And I definitely do not suggest, in fact, I would say please do not tell them that you're writing in response to a camera alert, and nor forward them our alert, because if they think that your letter is part of an organized campaign, they will not publish it. Number 8 is be impactful. Write a letter to the editor, but also sometimes you can find the email of the author of the piece right in the paper as well. So copy them, the reporter, copy the foreign editor, the publisher even. If it's on NPR or PBS, write to your congressman, congresswoman, senator, because they're providing the funding for it. If you're writing to a syndicated columnist, also write to the paper where that columnist is based, and to your paper as well. Number 9 is be available. So that's to include information about yourself, your name, the city and state where you live, and even your daytime phone number you could put in, not for publication, because they may want to call you just to verify that it's you, that you really wrote this. And so you may want to they may need that or ask for that. So be available. And number 10 is be engaged. So develop a relationship with the letters editor. So if you send in your letter, you might want to call up the paper and ask for the letters editor and ask if they received it, and ask if they would consider publishing it. And if they don't know if they got it, offer to resend it, offer to read it over the phone. If they don't publish, call up and ask why. Really try to get a relationship with the letters editor. If you do get published, send a thank you note. This is a great way to get this relationship started, and then you will, in fact, get more letters published, which, of course, is the goal, as well as just getting the editors themselves to read them. And so now we are going to go to your questions, and I apologize, of course, for running through things quite quickly, but this way we have more time for your questions. Thank you.
Okay, so one of the first questions is kind of the two sides of the coin. Someone has asked, could you list those news sources who are consistently anti-Israel? And then we had another question, which is, which media outlets do you recommend for unbiased coverage of Israel?
So this is I get this question a lot, and the truth is, it's all over the map. What I recommend in terms of getting your news is from multiple sources. So read multiple news sources, read American coverage, read Israeli coverage in English. You can read Times of Israel, you can read Jerusalem Post. There are a lot of outlets that you can go to, and I recommend going to multiple outlets, because the truth is, even if you might think, for example, oh, Fox News is good on Israel, or the Wall Street Journal is good on Israel, the truth is that's not the case. All of the reporters are individuals, the editors are individuals, and we at Camera deal with pieces, media pieces, articles, broadcasts, etc., on a case-by-case basis. And we don't rate news organizations broadly. Things change. You may have a good reporter. That reporter may go on to another beat. Now you get a bad reporter, or vice versa. And so we really just look at the pieces themselves, and we work on those. And you will find good coverage in lots of different places, and you will find bad coverage in lots of different places.
Okay, so this next question we received, you kind of hit on it in your presentation, but I just want to read it and hear what you have to say. So, it seems every time I attempt or begin to attempt a letter, it quickly becomes snarky, sarcastic. I know that letters should be respectful, so I don't continue to write or send it. So this person asks, is it okay to send a letter that's snarky?
Well, it's okay. It's a free country, and so you're welcome to send a snarky letter. I think it's okay to send a kind of cheeky letter, maybe a little wink of sarcasm. But if you want to get your letter published, it's better to be more straightforward. You could turn a clever phrase. If you're really angry and you want to be really snarky, write that version and then write the more calm version and send that one off.
So,
by the way, I relate.
As we all do.
Right.
So the next question is about social media. Is that a good way to get your ideas across?
It absolutely is. So social media is very powerful. First of all, you can also take your letter that you wrote, your letter to the editor, and post it on your Facebook page, right? And post it, and then all your friends will see it. And then you can take that link and tweet it to the reporter directly. Most reporters, most journalists, editors, they're on social media. You can go to their pages and post, and you can post your comments, or you can post a link to your letter to the editor that you posted on your own Facebook. So that's one way, and that's important. The other benefit of social media is that your friends, people that know you and respect you, will learn a thing or two as well. And that's just as important. So it's a very useful way to bring out the truth about Israel. So I recommend it.
Okay, so this next question, we love to hear this, by the way. I used to support another organization, but now support Camera, since, in my opinion, it covers American sources better. However, neither organization seems to be very interested in smaller local newspapers, which are the most biased. And when I saw this question, it reminded me that here in Florida, I get requests all the time, or comments all the time, about how biased the Palm Beach Post is. And why can't we do something about the Palm Beach Post? So this person asks somewhat the same thing. Can some of these smaller newspapers be highlighted in Camera reports? Or I would add, what can people do about the smaller publications?
So this is great. This is where we really, really need you letter writers. What I would hope you would do is, let's say it's not just you who has a problem with your local paper, but maybe there are 4 or 5 of your friends. What we would say is, why don't you form a letter writing group? When you see difficult pieces about that are in your local paper, share it with the other 4 members of your group. Each of you pick out something you don't like about that, and each of you write a letter to the editor about that piece. Now they'll get 4 or 5 different letters, totally different, from local people. So local papers tend to print local letter writers. So that's very, very effective. The letters to the editor page is very, very highly read, especially in local papers. So that's really important. What we do at Camera, and then my kids would laugh, I just said do. What we do at Camera is we cover the wire services. A lot of local papers will use AP or UPI stories, and we do cover those, and those get reprinted in local papers. I will also say that you can even do more than a local letter writing group. I had, Zichronah Livracha, an incredible letter writer named Frankie Schwartzwald in Grand Prairie, Texas. And Frankie was this adorable little old lady, and her local paper was the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And she would write to the editor, not to a letter to the editor, but she would write to the editor-in-chief every day, commenting on any stories that they had about Israel, rating them as positive, negative, or neutral. Now, I know this because she would BCC us on all her letters. And in fact, I ask you, when you write letters to the editor, please BCC us, and the email is letters@camera.org. Letters@camera.org. BCC, blind copy us. And so I could watch over time Frankie's correspondence with the editor-in-chief, and his name was John Gravois, Gravois, and he went by Grav. And every day she would send him an email, this story, negative. Next day, this story, negative. Well, over time, the stories got remarkably more positive or neutral, which is amazing because she was making a real difference. And she wouldn't just say negative, she would tell him what was wrong with the article. And then if there was no story about Israel, she would suggest one, a positive story about a medical advance in Israel, or a scientific discovery, or some amazing charitable work being done. And so she was really educating him and forming that relationship. And it really made an impact because not only was he learning, but all the readers of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram were getting a better picture of Israel because of one person, because of Frankie doing this work. So that's what one voice can do.
Sarit, we have a few questions that kind of are very, very related. So the first one has to do with the consequences of what Camera does, and the fact that the same journalist or media group or politician who's exposed continues to spread falsehoods time and time again about Israel. So, for example, one person wrote, NPR, New York Times, and Washington Post seem immune to criticisms of their Israeli coverage, no matter how egregious. What can be done about it? A similar question has to do with how much ground has been made. The bias against Israel seems to be as bad as ever. So what do we do?
Well, I can tell you what we don't do is just throw up our hands and say, can't do anything about it. That we're never going to do. Okay, that's never, we're never doing that. Now, I want you to imagine how bad it would be if we weren't constantly fighting. So think about that. We can't prove a negative, but let me tell you, it'd be more negative. I will also say that and I hear this a lot, the bad stories on page 1 and the correction is on like the bottom of page 12. But the truth is that the corrections are made and then they're made online and then they live forever online. And that's a big difference. That makes a huge difference because the stories get changed when the corrections are made. So that's really important. And that makes a difference. Also, the editors they hear us in their heads. We do get under their skin. We know we get under their skin. And that's important because they have to really want to, tell these fabrications. What we'll often see is that it will get better. The coverage will get better when we're dealing with a particular editor or a particular bureau chief, for example. The coverage will get better over time because of our relationship, because of the work we do, because of the letters you write. And then that reporter will move on and then a new one will come in. We have to start all over again. Yes, that's true, but they do improve and you're getting the word out because again, the letters to the editor are very highly read. They're most clicked on and most read pages of publications. So you are informing the general public as well. So we're making a difference. We are making it better. It's definitely not great, but we are making a difference. It could be a lot worse.
So I'm not sure if you want to answer this one because it's very specific, but let me throw it out there. Writing to NPR doesn't go anywhere. What can we do to improve their coverage?
Well, okay, so keep writing. Also, as I said, write to your congressman, congresswoman, write to your senators, and make sure that they know that you don't want your taxpayer money going to fund this misinformation, disinformation being, of course, a very en vogue term, and that you don't appreciate it. It's your tax money. There are a lot of things that the government needs to spend money on, and disinformation isn't one of them. And make sure that all your friends, and again, get everybody you know through social media or your family and friends, write to their congresspeople, let them know, call your congressperson, call their office. They will take your call. They will listen, they will write down what you have to say. Go ahead and, let's kick up a stink about it. But certainly it is egregious. It is, but we have to keep fighting.
Is overpublication of Israel, if the coverage is accurate, why does that show bias?
Well, that's because people think that Israel's an enormous country. I remember a girlfriend of mine married a British guy, and we were out to dinner, and he thought that Israel had 50 million residents. He was telling me, and I'm saying to him, no, it's 8 million. It was 8 million at the time, people. And he's like, no chance. I said, really? This is how the idea spreads. So then Israel becomes this big Goliath. Israel's the Goliath, and then the Palestinians are this little David. Of course, it's the opposite. So this overcoverage of Israel and this idea that somehow Israel is more important, more sinister, right up there with the worst human rights offenders. Now, if it's all great coverage, great, but it isn't all great coverage. It's not going to be all great coverage. So that's why, for example, is Israel always on the front page? And countries that have much more to do with the lives of Americans, way, way back in a little paragraph. There's a saying, of course, if it bleeds, it leads. There's another saying, if it's Jews, it's news.
So our next listener wants to know how to obtain facts about Palestinian human rights, even those that may not put Israel in the best light, but so that we can all get a true understanding of what the issues are. So what are the reliable sources to get the facts, the truth about Palestinian human rights?
Well, so it depends. It depends on what area. Um, the foreign ministry, there are many sources. There are academics. And again, I would go to multiple sources, but it depends on what specific facts, about Palestinian lives you want to know. But for the most part, Palestinian lives are controlled by their leadership. So the PA controls most of the Palestinian population, the vast majority living in Judea and Samaria, and Hamas controls the lives of the Palestinians living in Gaza. And then there are Palestinians in Lebanon whose lives are controlled by the Lebanese government, in Jordan whose lives are controlled by the Jordanians, etc. So wherever they're living, their lives are controlled by their leaders. And there are many places to get the information, but one would start with their, with the knowledge that Israel doesn't control the lives of Palestinians.
So this next question kind of takes it one step further, which is, could you explain how the human rights of Palestinians under Israeli governments are far more liberal, free, and legally protected as compared to the rights of Palestinians in any other Arab country, in any Arab country?
Well, no question. So first of all, I have to make a distinction between Israeli Arab citizens of Israel, and Palestinians who are again, whose lives are controlled by the Palestinian Authority or Hamas or Lebanon, etc. Now, there are some Arab non-citizens who may identify as Palestinians who live in Israel, but they are given the exact same rights as any other non-citizen residents of Israel, whether they are Arab or any other nationality, British. Anybody who lives in Israel who isn't a citizen has the rights of residence. Any citizen of Israel, whether they be Arab Israelis or Jewish Israelis or Ethiopian Israelis or Druze Israelis or Baha'i Israelis, whatever they may be, they have the same rights. And of course, Israel's a free country, so they have all kinds of rights: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to vote, freedom of assembly, all the freedoms you could possibly want, freedom to vote in the million elections that they have in Israel. And so that is the freest country. Israel's the freest country in the whole area. And because of that, the citizens there have all those freedoms, whether they be Arab citizens, whether they be Muslim Arab citizens, Christian Arab citizens, or whether they be Jewish citizens. They all have the same rights versus, again, residents of any ethnicity of Israel. And then there are these Palestinians who do not live in Israel, who live in under the Palestinian Authority, under Hamas or other governments, and they have those rights. Now, none of those places is free. None of those places is free, so their rights are very curtailed, but that's according to the rulings of their leadership.
Could you comment, this goes along with that same train of thought, could you comment on the persecution of Christians, for example, in Gaza, in other Arab countries, versus the way Christians are treated in Israel?
Absolutely. So, of course, in Israel, all houses of worship are protected, and freedom of worship is totally protected. In other places, in Hamas-run Gaza Strip, for example, Christians are persecuted. Christian bookstores have been burned. In Muslim countries broadly, Christians are persecuted. In Pakistan, etc. Very famous famous cases of persecution of Christians. In Egypt, I'm not exactly sure right now what's the law, but for a time it was illegal to build a church, and in fact it was illegal to even repair a church that, you know, something that needed maintenance. That was illegal. It may still be, I can't say for sure. In Bethlehem, for example, Bethlehem used to be a predominantly Christian Arab town. As you would imagine, Bethlehem being the birthplace of Jesus Christ. So Jesus was born there, and was a predominantly Christian town. And it was a predominantly Christian town up until the Oslo Accords, when Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization set up the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and they started running Bethlehem, and the Christian population of Bethlehem has decreased and decreased and decreased because of persecution, and now it is a majority Muslim town. So it is very, very sad, but those leaderships and those governing bodies are not free and fair and do persecute Christian minorities. It's a real problem. The opposite is true of Israel, where the Christian population of Israel is growing at the fastest rate of any country in the Middle East.
So we're almost out of time. So I'm going to take it upon myself to read 2 comments. And all of you, please believe me, these are comments that just came in, anonymous sources. I did not write these. The first one, in capital letters, camera is amazing. A voice, your many voices, give me hope and keep me sane. Thank you, camera. And the second anonymous statement, we must write, because silence gives assent. If more wrote, the coverage actually would incorporate good journalistic standards to a greater degree. So on those 2 notes, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. I want to especially thank Sarit for her fantastic presentation. I want to invite all of you to please join us for our next webinar on February 11th. And of course, the last thing I want to say is, now that the program is coming to a close, please don't forget to sit down right now to write that check to Camera, or go to camera.org to donate. We cannot do all the wonderful, fantastic things that we do without your financial support. So in whatever amount you feel comfortable, please make that donation today. And again, thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you on February 11th.